Mula maupo sa Malacanang si Pangulong Bongbong Marcos, 11 times o 11 beses nang nananalo ang kanyang pamilya o di kaya ang kanilang mga cronies sa Sandigan Bayan, kaugnay ito ng mga kasong nakaw na yaman ng diktador. Tinabulate namin yung mga resolution at decision ng Sandigan Bayan mula 2010 because this is the oldest that's uploaded on the website. At ito yung nakita namin. Yung 11 times na panalo ng mga Marcos-related case ay napakarami. Because if you compare it, 3 lang yung Marcos-related wins from 2010 to 2016 o sa panahon ni Pangulong Noynoy Aquino at 9 naman ang Marcos-related wins sa panahon ni Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte from 2016 to 2022. So yung batting average dati ay halos once a year or 12 times in 12 years. Ngayon ay halos 4 times a year na. And 3 out of these 11 wins, ang pleading ay si President Bongbong Marcos Jr. mismo ang nag-file. The first one, he filed months before he became president. And the second and third, he filed and won in 2024 while he was already the president. Paano nga ba mababawi ng taong bayan ang nakaw na yaman ng mga Marcos kung ang Marcos din ang nakaupo? Hello and welcome. I am Lian Buan. Welcome to Rappler Talk at makakausap natin si Attorney Ruben Carranza na eksperto sa usaping ito. Dati siyang Commissioner ng Presidential Commission on Good Government at isa ring eksperto ng Transitional Justice. Joining us from New York, maraming salamat for the time. Again, Attorney Carranza, we've talked about this so many times.
Maraming salamat din for having me.
I've already sent you the findings, no? So I'll go straight to the question. Yung panalo, 11 in 3 years, pwede ba nating bigyan yun ng benefit of the doubt? Baka natsempuhan lang kasi nga naman 36 years old na tong mga kasong to, baka they were due to be resolved and it just so happens na nanalo this time. Do we give him the benefit of the doubt?
No, because there's reality and there's the concept of benefit of the doubt or legal assumptions. And dito sa sitwasyon na to, hindi na pwedeng pairalin yung paniniwala na bulag yung korte sa politika, sa sinong may kapangyarihan. We can't rely on the principle that justice is blind, that justice does not care for who is in power or the politics of the litigation before a court, whether it's the Anti-Corruption Court, the Supreme Court, or the Office of the Solicitor General. I think dalawang bagay importante sigurong ipasok sa pagtingin, no? Kung bakit nananalo ang mga Marcos, mas nananalo ang mga Marcos sa panahon ni Duterte at of course lalo na sa panahon ni Marcos. Dahil ang may kapangyarihan ang mga Marcos. No? Si Duterte naging Pangulo dahil kay Marcos. Si Marcos naging Pangulo dahil kay Duterte. No? So these two families obviously shared the interests of the Marcoses. Duterte buried the dictator as a national hero. And of course, the son came back based on the lies that were propagated by Marcos and Duterte. But a very specific reason why they would win under Duterte and under Marcos. The Solicitor General under Duterte was a Marcos loyalist. And it's a Solicitor General that litigates the cases filed by the PCGG or by the Office of the Ombudsman or Special Prosecutor. So whether it's the civil cases for the recovery of ill-gotten assets or the criminal cases against still living Marcos cronies and officials, it's the Office of the Solicitor General that represents the Republic, Republic versus Sandigan Bayan if it's an appeal. No? So if you appoint a Marcos loyalist as your Solicitor General, obviously he's going to be loyal to Marcos. But the other aspect to this is many of the appointees to the Sandigan Bayan all the way up to the Supreme Court, were either directly picked by Rodrigo Duterte. That's how you could get away with impeaching the Chief Justice, right? Because that's an example of how even outside of the Marcos Duterte cases, you control the judiciary. You impeach the Chief Justice. You remove her and you replace her with someone whose loyalty is unquestionable. Many of these appointees were appointed by Duterte, and now Marcos is appointing replacements. But some of them, even those who were not appointed by Duterte, rose through the Judiciary from the Office of the Solicitor General. Their careers go all the way back to not necessarily the dictatorship, although it's possible, but to some degree of connection to the now deceased Estelito Mendoza, the only Justice Secretary of Marcos and the only Solicitor General of Marcos. Now, that influence of Estelito Mendoza cannot be understated. So that almost predetermined the outcome of these cases until the Supreme Court of the Philippines effectively refused to listen to Estelito Mendoza, including his extrajudicial approaches to the Supreme Court. There was just no way that the major cases of the PCGG could have been won. And that's also the history of the major cases won by the PCGG. Those few cases were cases in which we somehow managed to overcome the almost default preference of the Supreme Court to favor Estelito Mendoza's clients.
Well, Attorney Mendoza has passed now, no? As we know, banggit ko lang.
And I don't lament his passing whatsoever.
To clarify to the audience, you were talking about Solicitor General Jose Calida, yung Marcos loyalist Solicitor General ni President Duterte. So could we also assume na during his 6 years as Solgen, naging ripe for win? Could we say that? Kasi 6 years trinabaho yun ng OSG, so it ripened to win during a Marcos presidency.
And here's the difference in the winning by Calida of Marcos cases and Marcos crony cases versus the winning by Estelito Mendoza of some of those cases as well. In the case of Estelito Mendoza, there was a pattern of influencing Supreme Court justices, whether directly, for instance, letter writing. Outside of the judicial process, you write letters to the justices. For example, the Imelda Marcos case, the first one, the first criminal case against her in which she eventually was acquitted, that involved a lot of influencing by Estelito Mendoza. In contrast, the wins of Jose Calida were a different pattern, and this is, I think, borne out by the research that you did, because the basis in some of those cases was just to say there has been a long delay in litigating these cases, right? Which is true. Objectively, the cases have long been delayed. But the outcome is we will therefore rule in favor of the Marcos family. Why would a long delay necessarily mean ruling in favor of the Marcos family? I would understand that in criminal cases because there is a constitutional provision saying that you have the right to a speedy trial, but you do not have the right to a speedy trial in civil cases generally, but even more so in the ill-gotten wealth cases filed by the PCGG. Why? Because there's a law, there's actually a law, Executive Order number 14, which is a law issued by Corazon Aquino, that says that these technicalities, including rules on delay, on the length of trials, these are not going to be considered seriously as a basis for determining the cases. The cases should be decided on the merits. And the whole premise of this is that these cases are of an extraordinary character that you don't apply ordinary rules of court, ordinary rules of procedure to them. And that was disregarded during the Calida period. He won cases simply by telling the judges in the Sandigan Bayan, it's been too long, please dismiss, and they just go ahead and dismiss.
Interestingly, yung dalawang panalo ni BBM noong 2024 while he was president, the ponente is Justice Geraldine Faith Ekong, who in 2025 was appointed to be the presiding justice of Sandigan Bayan by President Marcos. You've observed the judiciary long enough. What can you say about this? Again, is it just a coincidence?
Of course, we already know that one of the hallmarks of judicial appointments in the Philippines is the same hallmark that we probably inherited from feudal Spanish practice, no? Ninong, having a godfather, having a godmother. And so these appointments are based on political backing. And whether we like it or not, and we should not like it, that's been the pattern in the judiciary, whether of Sandigan Bayan Justice appointments or Supreme Court appointments. But there have been very obvious examples where the appointments are intended really to address the needs of the appointee. So in the case of Ekong, as far as I can see, she knows the political basis for her appointment, and this is a person who, together with the, I think, incumbent ombudsman, visited Rodrigo Duterte, right? Just soon after or before their appointments, but in any case, tried to rationalize it as just a social visit. You know, that's one of the first things you learn in judicial and legal ethics in law school. The life of a judge, particularly, is meant to be a life in which you exclude yourself, essentially, from society. Now, of course, that's too Spartan, but and not to be taken literally, but that's what she essentially violated right away. So I would compare that, for example, to her predecessor, Justice
Kabutahe Tang.
Kabutahe Tang, who by the way, I worked with when she was a Assistant Solicitor General and I was Commissioner in prosecuting the coconut levy cases, which at least at that time we won. There, I think there was a level of independence in which, you know, you could see some kind of pattern, at least, that cases could be seriously litigated against the Marcoses, their cronies at the Sandigan Bayan. And of course, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was also when the conviction of Imelda Marcos for corruption happened in 2018. I remember, for example, Justice Lagos. It was one of them, and you can see here also the difference between justices who do not fear the political repercussions of their decisions and the competence of those justices, because you have to put those two things together: justices that are independent and justices that are competent. One or the other missing, you have a problem.
Going back to President Marcos, I take particular interest in the fact na siya yung nag-file nung ilan sa mga naipanalong Marcos-related case. Okay, he is the court-appointed administrator of the estate. But the reason why interesado ako dun sa fact na yun is because in April 2024, isa sa mga forum ng FOCAP, he was asked about, you know, paano aandar yung mga kaso under you. And he said, to quote him, the previous cases that are post-1986, I have not touched. It would be highly improper for me to involve myself in that. That was in April 2024, and according to the records, by June and July, which is months after that forum, siya yung nag-file ng motion to dismiss. So he contradicted himself. Bukod sa pagkocontradict ng sarili niya, should the president be filing this on the behalf of the estate? Could it be Imelda na lang sana para may konting delikadeza naman? Kasi could we say that Imelda can file it just herself without BBM?
Sa kampanya pa lang, naalala ko, nang nangangampanya pa lang si Marcos Jr., tinanong siya anong mangyayari sa PCGG. It's a Presidential Commission on Good Government. Ang sagot niya, akala niya siguro yung sagot niya was neutral, was well-intentioned. You know, he thought he was framing an answer that didn't betray his intentions. He said, we might use it to pursue ill-gotten wealth cases in general and corruption more generally. So, nakikita mo na doon na he was trying to erase the history of the PCGG as a commission created to go after him and his family. Right? But what makes it worse is that answer is also just simply intellectually dishonest, because if you become president and you're the Marcos that is referred to in the law creating the PCGG, it actually says there that commission was created to go after the Marcoses and their cronies. There is in other words, there was a legislative finding of fact in the law that said the Marcoses were corrupt. You cannot change that, right? The only problem now would be to recover the assets they obtained from corruption. But he never said anything like, I will not be the person to appoint PCGG commissioners. I will not be a person who will determine what the Solicitor General that I appoint will do in the PCGG cases. Never said anything like that. So it's not a surprise that he himself would appear or sign or take active interest in the cases involving their family, but also because you can see the contrast here. When it is a matter of the family and the estate of Marcos Sr. paying taxes, for example, right? He pretends that, oh, I'll refer this to our lawyers, right? But he appoints a BIR commissioner who is in charge of that. But that's different from the actual cases in which he participates, right? One example that's glaring here is in the Lucio Tan case, which was one of the cases dismissed by the Sandigan Bayan and then affirmed by the Supreme Court, I think, in 2023. I personally did not litigate this case when I was commissioner, but I knew the PCGG lawyer who was not part of the Solicitor General's office who handled this case, Catalino Generillo. Because I actually selected him when he applied as a lawyer for the PCGG. Here, Marcos Jr. wanted to testify. But of course, that's fine because he wasn't running for president. He wasn't president yet. The PCGG even then proposed to make him a hostile witness for the Republic because obviously, well, his family has been claiming that 60% of Lucio Tan's assets are owned by the Marcos family, right? So, fine, no, you can litigate that. We will hear what you have to say as a witness. You're a private person, go ahead and go to court. But once the case coincided with his presidency, then obviously, you would have to do something that you couldn't, care about before you became president. The other important thing about this Lucio Tan case is that you have a concurring and dissenting opinion that I think is important from Justice Marvic Leone. And he points out very, very specifically that these claims of delay, which is what their basis was, among others, and these claims that the evidence was photocopies. You hear this very often, right? Xerox copy lang, or ang tagal na niyan. Ano kasi yan yung ginagamit yan to reinforce in the public mind that these cases were sloppily handled, which is not true. If there is sloppiness, it comes from solicitor generals who deliberately get sloppy. But you can compare that with Simeon Marcelo when he was solicitor general and how we won both the Swiss Bank's case and the Coco Levy cases. So in the concurring dissenting opinion of Justice Leon, and malinaw sinasabi niya, yung mga delay, hindi yan dapat ina-attribute lang sa PCGG. Alam ko yan personally because ang mga Marcos grabe makadelay, grabe makafile ang motion. Si Imelda, papalit-palit ng abogado and every time she changes lawyers, you get a delay of almost a year. So you can imagine why it would go on and on. She's still alive, she gets new lawyers. Second, sabi ni Justice Leonen, yung mga photocopy, yung mga Xerox copies, while some of them may not be admissible because for other purposes, they're admissible for purposes of showing that the PCGG has these records, right? So you can't just ignore them. So what I'm saying here really is that this pattern of dismissing cases for delay, this pattern of saying that, this is not how ill-gotten wealth is defined, this is such a sloppy, simple-minded effort to favor the Marcoses and the Dutertes, and it's really shameless. And it's even more shameless for the Supreme Court to just affirm it as if, they're issuing some kind of brilliant edict that says, oh, it's okay to steal from the government because, this government cannot prove that the president who sits there stole this money.
Just to note, yung first Solicitor General ni BBM, si Menardo Guevara, used to be the lawyer of Imelda Marcos in one of these cases.
Correct.
that resulted in the Supreme Court charging them an estate tax na hindi pa nila nga binabayaran,
exactly.
as you noted.
Exactly, because it was their carelessness, in fact, na sila yung abogado tapos nakatanggap ng sabina, no? si Marcos, ang mga Marcos, and they pretended that they never got it, but they did. So yung law firm na Medialdea, Bella, Ata, they're the ones who represented the Marcos family, and he's the Solicitor General of Marcos. He was until recently.
Parang hindi rin uncommon yung defense on the part of the Marcoses na hindi nila natanggap. I believe yun din yung defense ni Amy Marcos doon sa
Amy
Taano,
Marcos,
diba?
exactly.
But
Yes.
going back, sir, to the PCGG, I note one case yung sa dummy company ni Roman Cruz na isa sa mga napanalo ni BBM on the basis of inordinate delay na yun nga, napakahaba na. The PCGG under him, after mag-file ng motion to dismiss ni BBM at ni Imelda, the PCGG under him filed a comment to say, there are no more, I quote, there are no more allegations against the estate of defendant Ferdinand E. Marcos for the plaintiff to substantiate. Could we see this as less eager na yung PCGG? As you said, PCGG has always taken a beating kapag may natatalo. Pero yung mga ganitong comment na wala na rin naman kaming ma-accuse sa estate, what do we make of this?
You sent me a copy of the PCGG's annual report 4, and you have a paragraph there that is very striking in the way they defeat their own mandate. They say that the PCGG has substantially accomplished its mandate, and therefore the PCGG now has to just preserve assets and then hopefully be given a different mandate to go after non-Marcos dictatorship officials. That's dereliction of duty. That's technically a violation of the law, because your mandate is to go after the Marcos family. You cannot pretend to have a different mandate because that's not your mandate. So dereliction of duty. And so this example of them saying, well, we have nothing more to say, it's really just a giveaway. And so when you have the institution that's supposed to investigate and pursue ill-gotten wealth cases, and you have the lawyer of the Republic essentially just giving up on arguing these cases, and you have justices in the Sandigan Bayan and in the Supreme Court appointed or still loyal to the president now in power, it's the Republic that loses.
Let's go to yung latest na napanalo, no? May 2025, if I'm not mistaken, yung kay Cocoy Romualdez. This is a Coco Levy case, I understand. When I went back to the records of the case, parang 2003 pa naman technically napanalo na ni Cocoy Romualdez. It's just that the Sandigan Bayan said, we will take custody of these assets first kasi kailangan meron kaming maibalik. And it was actually the Supreme Court in July 2022, again, when BBM was already president, na kumbaga nagpaandar na lang na parang, ibalik nyo na. You have no legal basis to still hold custody of that assets. First question, sir, how much ba yung maibabalik sa mga Romualdez? This is the father of House Speaker Martin Romualdez. How much ba ang pinag-uusapan natin? And number two, parang bakit ganon katagal from 2003? Tapos ngayon lang talagang napaandar. Ganon ba talaga yung kalakaran sa ganitong complex cases?
So there's three aspects to this, and let me try to simplify them because they are complex. These cases involve assets that belong to corporations that were dummy corporations created by the Romualdez family. No? So the father of Martin Romualdez, Benjamin Romualdez, who was ambassador of Marcos to the UK, to Saudi Arabia, to the US, everywhere, there were criminal cases against him. They were dismissed because he died. So the Martin Romualdez, Benjamin Romualdez family, his mother is named Juliet Romualdez, and as far as I know, she's still alive. So they created dummy companies. They used these companies to take over Meralco, to take over newspapers. So what became, I think, the Times Journal, also the Daily Express. They used these companies to take over what used to be Equitable Bank, if I'm not mistaken, which is now
PCI.
Banco de Oro. PCI Bank, and now Banco de Oro because of the mergers. In other words, controlling interest in, I think, the biggest bank in the Philippines. Benguet Mining Corporation. So when you see the title of the case, you don't recognize Trans-Middle East Corporation.
Yes, correct.
What is that? So you don't care. It's only when you realize that this was essentially the shell company, just the pretend company with Martin Romualdez and his family sitting there as directors and stockholders, controlling the takeover by the Romualdez and Marcos families of these key industries. Imagine that: water, electricity, banking, gold mining. So when Imelda Marcos says, it's mine, the joke, it's also literally true. They went into mining. The PCGG went after these assets, sequestered the assets, and so this recent decision is about that sequestration. Long story short, the sequestration was lifted, but the Romualdez family, for some reason, never tried to enforce the lifting of the sequestration until it was too late. Until, of course, Marcos Jr. became president, in which case it wasn't too late anymore. So can you imagine that? It was too late, and then now it's not too late anymore. The reason the case one reason the case lasted so long is because, and this is also present in other PCGG cases where significant assets and corporations are involved. The Lopez family wanted to get back Meralco, wanted to get back some of the assets they had in these companies. And so they also joined the case filed against the Romualdez family. So it's the Republic, represented by the PCGG, the Lopez family, and the Marcos and Romualdez family on the other side. Because the Lopezes have deep pockets. They have the money. No? May pera sila to keep going, unlike the PCGG, na dependent ka on these government lawyers at the OSG. The Lopez family kept funding the lawyers to go back and forth at the Sandigan Bayan, all the way up to the Supreme Court, down again and back. That's why the case kept going. Now, the reason I mentioned Juliet Romualdez, the mother, is because just before this decision, maybe about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, the Lopez family wanted to take her deposition, wanted her to testify to show exactly how the Romualdez family acquired these assets, what money they used to acquire these assets, and to show that these were in fact acquired using intimidation and pressure on the Lopezes. Of course, the Romualdez family argued she's old, she's frail, she's too sick. This is the same Juliet Romualdez who, together with Martin Romualdez, we still found $5 million in Swiss bank accounts in 2001 when I was PCGG commissioner. And this was already just their loose change left behind. So there was a lot still to litigate, and then suddenly, it's gone.
So kung tinatawag mo, Attorney Carranza, na loose change ang $5 million, we could be talking about so much more. Kung barya lang ang $5 million.
Kasama sa mga na-freeze ng Switzerland government, yung in the Swiss banks in which the Marcoses, hid and laundered their ill-gotten assets, pati yung mga cronies. No? So hindi lang ang mga Marcos ang bukas ng mga Swiss bank deposits, pati din yung cronies. So, yung mga Romualdez, Dicini, pinsan ni Imelda Marcos, at iba pa. No? So, kung ikaw yung PCGG ngayon, buhay pa yung mga kasong ayan. In fact, just as an example, now that I mention it, nanalo ang PCGG against the Dicini family. Although, under Duterte, the Supreme Court kept reducing the amount of damages, originally 1 billion something, right? That was more or less the amount of the loan na ninakaw ng Dicini family. Ginawa na lang nominal damages na parang hindi namin makalculate magkano yung ninakaw, magkano yung danyos na nangyari sa Pilipinas. So 100 million na lang ang babayaran ni Dicini dapat. Alam ko yan because ako yung naglitigate niyan Umalis na lang ako sa PCGG, nanalong years later. I don't know if the Dicinis have ever paid that amount of money. Now, if you were the PCGG, the least you could do is check and enforce that judgment, but they're not doing that.
Eh, yung estate tax nga, Attorney Carranza, 203 billion yung surcharge. So in your estimate, deep pa yung well of wealth ng mga Marcos that we possibly cannot see at evaluate?
Yes, and not just the Marcoses, but as we were talking about them, also the Romualdeses, because apparently, using the money that they were able to keep, because hindi na na-enforce yung judgment or na-dismiss yung mga kaso, they've been able to use both that wealth and the influence that they now have to invest even more elsewhere, including casinos apparently, or shares of stock in casinos. Yung mga Marcos naman, yung mga na-recover namin sa Swiss banks, yung mga na-recover na mga ari-arian, buildings and land, you cannot hide, you can try to defraud landowners, significant yung amount, right? But not necessarily the largest part of the ill-gotten wealth that they have hidden. So there is still a significant amount of money that the Marcoses have been able to keep. That money was precisely what they used to fund their campaign at first when Marcos Jr. ran as vice president, and then later when he ran again this time as president. And that money has been used to fund disinformation, social media by the Marcoses, and that money will be used by the Marcoses in their fight against the Duterte. So that's until that money is taken back, that will influence who rules the Philippines.
Talking about yung valuation ng money, still on this case yung Coco Levy ni Cocoy Romualdez. Actually, like years, di naman years, like a year before yung win this year, may panalo naman yung PCGG. Yung palm companies, di ba, parang nanalo sila but they did not file a motion to execute on time. And then they wanted to charge interest fees pero hindi rin pinagbigyan ng Sandigan Bayan. And I remember si former PCGG chairperson, si John Agbayani, will always tell me, oh, you know, nanalo ang mga Marcos, pero actually nakuha na namin yung pera. May mga ganong argument na parang zero naman yung value ng win na yun eh. So how do we explain this? Does every win equals money recovered by the Marcoses?
Some of the assets are ang tawag dyan, personal assets, not just jewelry is personal, but so are airplanes, aircraft. So may mga ganong assets that deteriorate literally or deteriorate in value. So that when they're recovered, they may not have as much value as they would have had at the time they were taken by the Marcoses. Example na lang, yung buildings dito sa New York. By the time the PCGG recovered them, by the time they were returned to the Republic, they had so much tax deficiencies, hindi nagbabayad ng tax, na inuna mo na yung pagbayad ng tax. So ilang million na lang natira when they could have had tens of millions or even hundreds of millions returned to the Republic. So that can happen because of the delay in litigation, because the Marcoses themselves, when they fled into exile, they did not want to implicate themselves. So they were not running the assets that they were keeping and hiding. And so, hindi nag-increase yung value or bumaba pa yung value. So, another example is yung mga interest, and increase in value of, let's say, land. Technically, that should go to the owner of the asset, right? But without a finding, a final judgment, it has to be kept in trust. So yun yung nangyari sa mga interest. I don't know exactly what the former PCG chairperson was referring to, but shares of stock, bank deposits that have interest, have earnings, the Republic of the Philippines doesn't keep that until there's a judgment.
May papakita akong graph, Attorney Carranza. I also showed this to you earlier. Parang counter-narrative siya halos dahil while we say that ang dami nang napanalo in 3 years, their 2024 year-end report, sanabi nila they have never recovered so much money. From 2022 to 2024, yun, 2 billion, I think that's 2.3 billion, 2.6 billion, 2.2 billion. Can we explain this? Like, they're winning a lot, but also the government is recovering a lot. Parang paano yun?
The PCGG calculates the assets that it brings back to the Republic, not only in terms of what it wins in litigation, but what it sells after it wins. So I think that when they claim that this is the largest amount brought back to the Treasury, it's because these assets have been sold. So from the example you showed me, the assets of, I'm trying to remember the name of the logging company family, because I was involved in that case. The PCGG won, Alfonso Lim, the Alfonso Lim case. It was won many years ago, right? But of course, the enforcement of that judgment not only takes time. Remember, it's not the PCGG that tries to enforce; it's the Solicitor General, and all that this family has to do is keep delaying it and keep enjoying possession, etc. So it took a while, but when they finally were able to enforce it, that's when you can sell it, and that's what this PCGG is claiming to have done. They were not involved in litigating this case. I remember I had to do a lot of research because I myself had to draft pleadings. I did not leave it to the Solicitor General's office to file pleadings when it came to the Supreme Court, because we were also doing, I guess, rearguard action, right? You may have won the case, but when it goes on appeal to the Supreme Court, you know how influence peddling, how Islito Mendoza and people like him will try to nullify your victory. So it was important to me before the Supreme Court to not give any one of these justices an excuse to say this is not a well-argued case. So in the Alfonso Lim case involving, for instance, logging concessions, I even used the book of Marites Vito, tracing it so that the justices understand a story here. This isn't just litigation. There's a story. How did Alfonso Lim manage to carve out all these logging concessions in northern Luzon? Because Marcos was his partner. And so you have to show that. And so that took years to do. And we finally won. When did the PCGG finally sell these assets? Under Marcos.
So you're saying na matagal nang napanalo tong mga to, tas ngayon lang ibinenta. So ngayon lang nagkaroon ng pera.
Yeah, because it takes a lot of technical effort. You need to clean up the titles. You need to measure the land. You need to remove informal settlers. You need to pay workers who were not paid by the logging company, using these examples, right? So for these commissioners, it's just a matter of summarizing all of it in one sentence. Oh, we sold this asset, right? But they don't talk about the assets that they have given up on recovery, for example.
I've also written previously, may isang nanalo sa Sandigan Bayan, and the dissenters were saying, they won, but they actually won nothing, no?
Nothing.
So yung existential question ko lagi ay, yung pagpakapanalo ba, pera ba talaga yung nakataya dito? O publicity? Kasi every time there's a headline that says Sandigan Bayan dismisses a Marcos case, that's fuel for the narrative na wala naman silang ginawa, hindi naman sila nagnakaw. So, for you, what's at stake? Money or publicity?
And let me say first that I really, really appreciated that article that you wrote, because it clarified using this concurring opinion of a Sandigan Bayan justice that says we already decided in the past that the Marcoses stole wealth, and those are ill-gotten. So anything that says, okay, these cases should be dismissed because they're delayed, because there are no assets to litigate anymore, doesn't mean that they did not steal, right? And what I think what is important from that decision is that it shows that once you have a decisive case that establishes how much the assets of the Marcoses legitimately are and how much of their assets are not legitimate and are therefore ill-gotten, anything else that you talk about, anything else that they claim are theirs, out beyond their legitimate assets, is ill-gotten. And that precisely was the decision in 2003. So anything else outside of the $104,000 that the Marcoses, according to the Supreme Court of the Philippines, legitimately earned as president and as governor of Metro Manila, anything above that is ill-gotten. To me, if I were in the PCGG today, all I would do is to enforce that judgment against any asset that I see that the Marcoses are still claiming. And that is precisely what I did before I left the PCGG. I filed several of these motions saying enforce this judgment against the jewelry of Imelda Marcos. That's how the PCGG wanted in 2017. Enforce this judgment against the paintings stolen by Imelda Marcos. You can keep doing that, but for some reason they don't. So you're right. When the Supreme Court of Sandigan Bayan says yun, sasabihin, oh, binasura na naman ang kaso. Kaso yan, no? Hindi yan asset. Hindi yan nakaw na yaman. Hindi yan ibig sabihin na may mapupunta sa mga Marcos dahil na basura o na-dismiss yung kaso. Ang ibig lang sabihin na yan, na yung transaksyon na ginawa nila, na hindi napatunayan na ginawa nila, pero hindi ibig sabihin na yung asset na nakuha nila sa kanila because lampas ito sa legal na asset na ari-arian na pwedeng sabihin ng mga Marcos na lehitimong kanila. So, no matter how they argue, this case was dismissed. This case was overruled. This judgment was for the Marcoses. You cannot change this 2003 judgment that said anything else above this amount of money is ill-gotten.
Speaking of enforcing a win, last year may isang, for me, it's a spectacular win yung Supreme Court saying na void and illegal yung pag-take over ng diktador sa mga paway properties. And it's a damning decision pag binasa mo, parang unconstitutional, parang bakit naman mapupunta sa mga Marcos ang tiesa naman ng gumastos at yung mga land title na kinuha ng mga anak ni Senator Amy Marcos. So part of that decision says, actually kahit may titulo sila Borgie Manotok, ganyan, pwedeng kunin yan ng OSG. But the OSG has to get the yes of the president. Si BBM na nga yung president. So Marcos now has a new Solicitor General. Ano yung kailangan niyang gawin? Attorney Darlene Berbera, ano yung kailangan niyang gawin? And she has as my live case, yung Paway property, what does she need to do?
You know, when I was a law student, merong student political party sa UP Diliman that ran against the main parties. I think it was called the Independent Student Alliance. And it was a progressive party. No? Yung mga kandidato niya, anti-Marcos, were all for accountability, to hold the Marcoses accountable. And one of the candidates was Darlene Berberabe. So I was collegiate editor. She was a candidate there. And I know that she understands what happened during the dictatorship and what accountability is still owed by the Marcos family. And the office of the Solicitor General is not the office of the President of the Philippines. It's an office under the Republic of the Philippines. So perhaps one of the first things she should do is to test the power of that office to enforce judgments that the office won. And so this example is a good example of testing that. Because rescission of title yan eh. And you don't even have to go through the lower courts to do it because you already have a Supreme Court decision saying so. And I don't see why that isn't just an easy case to win. It doesn't even involve the PCGG anymore. It's the Republic that has won and won back these assets, and the Republic that needs to have these assets returned to it.
I mean,
so she should use the easiest cases to prove her independence, and then tactically make sure that the person who appointed her understands that she does not represent him. She represents the country.
Well, are you surprised that the Marcoses didn't react to this win? Kasi, as I said, like, if you read it, it's pretty damning. Couldn't have they just returned these parcels of land? Or nasurpresa ka ba na wala silang, sige, babalik na namin for the benefit of the people?
It's hubris, no? Yung belief that nobody can hold you accountable. And so you have the Marcoses having that belief. You have the Dutertes having that belief. Kaya sila nag-aaway kasi parehong may hubris. No? Yung idea na walang makakapagpilit sa amin na madalagot kami. So it's not surprising because this is the same Jaime Marcos, right? Who was found liable by the U.S. legal system to pay a person that her bodyguards and her extrajudicially killed. This was the same Jaime Marcos who is involved in the $2 billion judgment in the Hawaii court, and her brother is the administrator of the estate that's supposed to pay. So, hindi lang sila walang pakialam, kundi harap-harapan, no? Harap-harapan sasabihin nila na hindi namin susundin ng batas. Kung dito mo makikita yung kaibahan ng yung principled opposition versus simply opposition for the sake of power. The Dutertes have never raised these questions against the Marcoses. You don't hear Sara Duterte or her brothers or her father say, oh, ang dami niyong nakaw na yaman, babawiin namin yan kung maging presidente kami. What did Rodrigo Duterte say? He said, oh, mayaman naman sila eh. So that is, in other words, just the Dutertes looking for power and not looking for accountability. The same with the Marcoses, right? So until this reality is seen by Filipino voters, and maybe they have, maybe they will, it's difficult to move the country forward.
Last question na lang. Para ma-appreciate ng mga Pilipino, para saan pa pwedeng gastusin yung mga pwedeng ma-recover sa mga Marcos bukod sa ibalik sa mga coconut farmers, bukod sa reparation for martial law victims? Could this fund other services that the ordinary Filipino that has nothing to do with martial law can benefit from?
So, importante, no? Dahil ginagamit yan na isa pang kasinungalingan, no, ng mga Marcos na propagandist na yung mga nabalik nabawi ng PCGG kung saan lang napupunta, no? Ayaw nilang kilalanin na tatlo yung napupuntahan ngayon, no? Unang-una, agrarian reform, pagbili ng lupa para sa mga magsasakang walang lupa. Yun yung original intention, no, ng kung saan dinadala yung assets that are recovered. Pangalawa, yung reparations law that I helped draft. So may batas yan, no? So nagbigay ng danyo sa mga biktima ng mga Marcos ng human rights violations. Pangatlo, yung COCO levy. May COCO levy trust fund. Dapat binabalik sa magsasaka, mga magdiniyog. My fear is that if you draft a law that adds any other purpose under a Marcos presidency or a Duterte presidency, then you're just opening the door to ill-gotten wealth becoming ill-gotten even more. Right? So what you can do is to add to these three sources. These three funds. Add money to agrarian reform. Add money to victims of the dictatorship. Maraming hindi nakatanggap ng danyos na mga bangsa moro because hindi makapagbigay ng ebidensya na namasaker sila sa hulo, halimbawa. Ibigay na sa mga magdiniyog ang perang ninakaw sa kanila kahit nakalahati na lang ang tinira ng Sandigan Bayan at ng Supreme Court. So you can do these things with any asset that you can still recover, or in fact assets that you have recovered but have not liquidated.
All right, that was almost an hour of conversation and so much we have talked about, but there's still so much more to unpack about these complex cases of ill-gotten wealth by the Marcoses. Thank you so much, Attorney Ruben Carranza. This has been Lian Buan. Thank you for watching Rappler Talk.